My name is Madison Carter, and 3 weeks ago I discovered that everything I thought I knew about loyalty, family, and trust was built on lies. As I sat in my car outside the Riverside Cafe, hands trembling as I stared through the rain-streaked windshield, I watched my cousin Brooklyn laugh intimately with my ex-boyfriend Ryan, her manicured fingers intertwined with his across the small corner table. The same cousin who had spent the last 8 months telling anyone who would listen that my marriage to David was falling apart, that I was neglecting my husband, that I was probably having an affair myself. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was Brooklyn, the woman who had positioned herself as the concerned family member, the one who supposedly cared so much about preserving marriages and family values, sitting in a dimly lit cafe with the man I dated for 3 years before I met David. The same Ryan who had broken my heart so completely that it took me 2 years to even consider dating again. The same Ryan who Brooklyn had consoled me over, held me while I cried about, and sworn she'd never forgive for what he put me through. I should have driven away. Any rational person would have turned the key, put the car in reverse, and pretended they'd never seen what I was witnessing. But I couldn't move. I was frozen by the devastating realization that the person I'd trusted most in my family had been systematically destroying my reputation while secretly reconnecting with the one person who had already broken me once before. The rain began falling harder, creating a rhythmic drumming on my roof that somehow matched the pounding of my heart. Through the cafe window, I could see Brooklyn leaning closer to Ryan, her auburn hair falling like a curtain as she whispered something that made him throw his head back and laugh. It was the same laugh that had once made my stomach flutter with butterflies. Now it made me feel sick. Brooklyn had always been beautiful in that effortless way that made other women simultaneously admire and resent her. At 28, 2 years younger than me, she had the kind of natural charisma that drew people to her like moths to a flame. Growing up, she was the cousin everyone compared me to. Brooklyn got better grades without studying. Brooklyn had boys calling the house constantly. Brooklyn could walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention. I'd learned to accept living in her shadow, telling myself that our differences made us complement each other perfectly. When I started dating David 4 years ago, Brooklyn had been nothing but supportive. She helped me pick out outfits for our early dates, listened to me analyze every text message he sent, and even gave me advice on how to navigate his family dynamics. She was my maid of honor when David and I got married 2 years later, giving a speech that brought tears to everyone's eyes about how perfect we were for each other and how she'd never seen me happier. That's what made this betrayal so much more devastating. Brooklyn hadn't just been spreading lies about my marriage to random people. She'd been telling these stories to our extended family, to mutual friends, to neighbors, to anyone who would listen. And she'd been doing it with such apparent concern, such convincing worry about my well-being, that people actually thanked her for caring so much about me. The lies had started small and seemingly innocent. Brooklyn would mention to our Aunt Carol that I seemed stressed when she visited. She'd tell our cousin Jessica that David looked tired whenever she saw him at family gatherings, implying that I must be putting too much pressure on him. She'd casually comment to our grandmother that she was worried about me because I seemed distant lately, always distracted when we talked, but somewhere along the way, the concerned observations had evolved into something much more sinister. Brooklyn began suggesting that David and I were having serious problems. She'd lower her voice and confide in relatives that she thought I might be going through something, that my behavior had changed, that she was worried about the state of my marriage. She painted herself as the devoted cousin who was trying to help, while painting me as someone who was struggling, unstable, possibly unfaithful. The most insidious part was how she delivered these character assassinations. Brooklyn never said anything directly accusatory. She never claimed to have witnessed me doing anything inappropriate. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt with carefully crafted observations and leading questions. She'd mentioned that she'd seen me having lunch with a male colleague and then add, with apparent concern, that she hoped everything was okay at home. She'd comment that I'd been working late a lot lately and wonder aloud if David knew where I was spending all my time. Through this methodical campaign of whispered concerns and worried observations, Brooklyn had managed to convince a significant portion of our family that my marriage was in trouble, that I was potentially having an affair, and that David was suffering in silence. She'd positioned herself as the only person who truly cared about saving my relationship, the only one brave enough to acknowledge that there were problems. Meanwhile, I'd been completely oblivious to the narrative she was constructing around my life. David and I were actually doing well. We'd had our challenges like any couple, but we'd worked through them together. We'd recently started talking about buying a house, maybe starting a family in the next few years. I thought we were in a good place, building something solid and lasting together. The first hint that something was wrong came about 6 weeks ago when my cousin Marcus mentioned, almost casually, that he hoped David and I could work things out. I'd stared at him in confusion, asking what he meant, and he'd looked equally confused in return. He said Brooklyn had mentioned that we were going through a rough patch, that she was worried about us. When I told him that wasn't true, that David and I were fine, Marcus had seemed genuinely surprised. That conversation planted the first seed of suspicion in my mind. I started paying more attention to how family members interacted with me, looking for signs that they believed something about my marriage that wasn't true. It didn't take long to notice the subtle changes. The way conversations would pause when I entered a room. The careful, almost pitying way people asked about David. The knowing looks exchanged when I mentioned work trips or late nights at the office. 3 weeks ago, I'd finally confronted my grandmother about the strange undercurrent of concern I'd been sensing from everyone. Grandma Helen had been reluctant to say anything at first, but eventually she'd admitted that Brooklyn had expressed serious worries about my marriage. She'd told Grandma that she thought I might be having an affair, that David seemed miserable whenever she saw him, that she was considering staging an intervention to help save my relationship. The revelation had hit me like a physical blow. Brooklyn, my closest cousin, my former maid of honor, the person I'd trusted with my deepest secrets and fears, had been systematically destroying my reputation for months. She'd used her position as my confidant to gather information about my life and then twisted that information into a narrative that painted me as an unfaithful wife and a troubled person. But even as angry and hurt as I was by this discovery, I couldn't understand why Brooklyn would do such a thing. We'd never had any major conflicts. There had never been any competition between us over men, careers, or family attention. I'd always supported her endeavors, celebrated her successes, and been there for her during her disappointments. What could possibly motivate her to launch such a calculated attack on my character and my marriage? Now, sitting in my car watching her laugh with Ryan, I was beginning to understand. This wasn't random malice or some twisted form of entertainment. This was strategic. Brooklyn had been clearing the path for something, preparing the ground for a plan that was much more personal and devastating than I'd initially realized. Ryan looked exactly the same as he had 3 years ago when he'd broken up with me via text message while I was visiting my sick father in the hospital. Same dark hair that he ran his fingers through when he was nervous or excited. Same crooked smile that had once made me forgive him for showing up late or forgetting important dates. Same confident posture that had initially attracted me but eventually revealed itself as arrogance and self-centeredness. Watching him now, I couldn't believe I'd ever thought I was in love with him. But I also couldn't deny the sharp stab of betrayal I felt seeing him here with Brooklyn. Not because I wanted him back, but because the two people who had hurt me most in my romantic and family life had apparently found each other and were building something together on the foundation of lies Brooklyn had constructed about my marriage. The timing suddenly made perfect sense. Brooklyn's campaign against my reputation had started around the same time she and Ryan must have reconnected. She'd been preparing our family and social circle for the eventual revelation that my marriage was falling apart, setting the stage for her own relationship with my ex-boyfriend to seem like a natural development rather than a betrayal. As I watched them through the rain, Brooklyn reached across the table and wiped something from Ryan's cheek with an intimacy that spoke of familiarity, of a relationship that had moved far beyond casual coffee dates. They looked comfortable together, like a couple who had been together for months rather than weeks. Which meant this had been going on much longer than I'd realized, possibly from the very beginning of Brooklyn's whisper campaign about my marriage. To understand how devastating this betrayal truly was, you need to know about the relationship Brooklyn and I had built over the years, and how Ryan had shaped my understanding of love and trust long before David entered my life. Brooklyn Hayes and I grew up in adjacent neighborhoods in suburban Denver, our mothers being sisters who remained close despite their very different approaches to life. My mother, Linda, was the practical one who worked as a high school counselor and believed in structure, responsibility, and earning everything through hard work. Brooklyn's mother, Sandra, was the free spirit who had married into money and believed in following your heart, taking risks, and trusting that everything would work out for the best. These philosophical differences shaped how Brooklyn and I were raised, creating a dynamic that would define our relationship for decades. While I was encouraged to think through decisions carefully, save money, and build toward long-term goals, Brooklyn was taught to seize opportunities, trust her instincts, and worry about consequences later. Where my childhood was filled with piano lessons, honor roll certificates, and college preparation courses, Brooklyn's was characterized by spontaneous family trips, expensive art classes, and the freedom to quit activities the moment they stopped being fun. Despite these differences, or perhaps because of them, Brooklyn and I became incredibly close. During elementary school, I spent most weekends at her house, fascinated by the chaos and excitement that seemed to follow her family everywhere. Brooklyn's parents would decide on Friday afternoon to drive to the mountains for the weekend, throwing sleeping bags and snacks into their SUV without checking weather reports or making hotel reservations. My parents would have spent weeks researching campgrounds, creating detailed itineraries, and packing specialized equipment for every possible scenario. Brooklyn seemed to effortlessly excel at everything she attempted, but she also had the luxury of abandoning pursuits the moment they required serious effort or commitment. She quit ballet after 2 years because she didn't like the discipline required for recitals. She abandoned piano lessons because practicing became boring. She left the debate team because staying after school interfered with her social life. Each time, her parents supported her decision, telling her that life was too short to do things that didn't bring joy. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Meanwhile, I learned to stick with commitments even when they became difficult. I continued piano lessons through high school, not because I was particularly talented, but because I'd started and believed in finishing what I began. I stayed on the cross-country team despite being consistently one of the slower runners because I'd made a commitment to my teammates. I worked part-time jobs throughout high school to save money for college, while Brooklyn received a generous allowance that covered her expenses and entertainment. Our different upbringings created a relationship where I was simultaneously Brooklyn's biggest supporter and her most reliable safety net. When she needed help with homework she'd procrastinated on, I'd stay up late helping her complete assignments. When she wanted to try something new but lacked the patience to research it properly, I'd do the groundwork and present her with organized information. When she made impulsive decisions that didn't work out, I'd be there to listen, comfort, and help her figure out next steps. This pattern continued through college, where Brooklyn attended a prestigious private university paid for entirely by her parents, while I worked my way through a state school on academic scholarships and student loans. Brooklyn majored in communications, a field she chose because it seemed interesting and not too demanding. I studied business administration, selecting a practical degree that would lead to stable employment and the ability to pay back my educational investments. Even our approaches to dating reflected our different personalities and life philosophies. Brooklyn moved through relationships like she moved through hobbies, experiencing intense attraction and connection before growing bored or finding reasons to move on. She dated artists, musicians, aspiring actors, and entrepreneurs, drawn to creative and unpredictable personalities who promised excitement and adventure. I was more cautious with romantic relationships, partly by nature and partly because I couldn't afford the emotional luxury of dramatic breakups that interfered with my academic performance or work responsibilities. I dated occasionally but seriously, investing time and emotion only in relationships that seemed to have genuine potential for long-term compatibility. This is where Ryan Mitchell entered my life during my junior year of college. I was 21, working 25 hours a week at a campus bookstore while maintaining a full course load, and had little time or energy for the complicated dating dynamics that seemed to consume many of my peers. Ryan was a graduate student in the art history program, 3 years older than me, with the kind of intellectual confidence that I found incredibly attractive. Unlike the college guys I dated previously, Ryan seemed sophisticated and mature. He could discuss literature, politics, and philosophy with equal ease. He took me to poetry readings, independent film screenings, and gallery openings that felt far more cultured than the fraternity parties and sports bars that dominated most student social life. With Ryan, I felt like I was getting a preview of the adult life I was working so hard to build. Ryan was also completely different from anyone I'd ever been attracted to before. Where I was practical and future-focused, he was spontaneous and lived entirely in the present moment. Where I carefully budgeted every dollar, he spent money without thinking about consequences, trusting that everything would somehow work out. Where I planned and prepared for challenges, he improvised and relied on his charm to navigate difficulties. Initially, these differences felt complementary rather than problematic. Ryan helped me relax and enjoy experiences without constantly worrying about productivity or efficiency. I helped him organize his life and meet the practical responsibilities that his artistic temperament often overlooked. We balanced each other in ways that felt healthy and growth-promoting. Brooklyn absolutely loved Ryan from the moment I introduced them. She was fascinated by his stories about traveling through Europe after college, living in artist communes, and pursuing creative projects without worrying about traditional career paths. Ryan represented everything she found attractive in people: the willingness to prioritize passion over practicality, to take risks for the sake of authentic experiences. The three of us began spending significant time together, particularly during my senior year when Brooklyn would visit my campus regularly. She'd stay in my dorm room for long weekends, and we'd all go out together to the cultural events and social gatherings that Ryan preferred. Brooklyn and Ryan would engage in hours-long conversations about art, music, and philosophy while I listened. Sometimes feeling like the practical but boring third wheel in their dynamic. Looking back now, I can see signs that should have concerned me. The way Brooklyn and Ryan seemed to share private jokes that excluded me. How conversations between them would continue long after I'd grown tired and wanted to change subjects. The fact that Brooklyn started visiting my campus more frequently after I introduced her to Ryan than she had in the previous 3 years combined, but at the time, I was simply happy that two of the most important people in my life got along so well. It never occurred to me to be jealous or suspicious. Brooklyn was my cousin, my closest friend, someone I trusted completely. Ryan was my boyfriend, someone I was falling deeply in love with and beginning to imagine a future with. The idea that they might develop feelings for each other seemed impossible, not because they weren't compatible, but because I believed they both cared too much about me to ever betray my trust in such a fundamental way. Ryan and I dated for 3 years, from my junior year of college through my first year working full-time after graduation. During that time, our relationship evolved from the exciting intensity of new romance into something deeper and more complex. We talked about moving in together, about the possibility of marriage, about building a life that combined his creative ambitions with my career goals. Brooklyn remained a constant presence throughout our relationship, visiting whenever she was between jobs or romantic interests, which happened frequently given her pattern of pursuing exciting opportunities until they required sustained effort or commitment. She'd stay in our spare bedroom for weeks at a time, contributing to household expenses when she had money and relying on our generosity when she didn't. During these extended visits, Brooklyn would often spend more time with Ryan than I did. Given my demanding work schedule and her flexible lifestyle, she'd accompany him to gallery openings and cultural events when I was too tired after long workdays. She'd listen to his creative projects and offer feedback when I was distracted by professional responsibilities. She'd engage with his artistic interests in ways that my practical nature sometimes struggled to fully appreciate. Again, I saw this as positive rather than threatening. I was grateful that Brooklyn could provide Ryan with the kind of intellectual and creative companionship that my busy schedule didn't always allow. I trusted both of them completely, and I was happy that they'd developed such a strong friendship based on shared interests and compatible personalities. The end of my relationship with Ryan came suddenly and devastatingly during what should have been one of the most difficult periods of my life. My father had been diagnosed with cancer and was undergoing aggressive treatment that required me to travel frequently between my city and my parents' home 3 hours away. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and relying heavily on Ryan's support to get through each day. Brooklyn had been staying with us for nearly a month during this period, supposedly to help support me through my father's illness. She'd cook meals, handle household tasks, and keep Ryan company when I was traveling back and forth to be with my family. I was incredibly grateful for her presence and support during such a challenging time. Then, on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting in a hospital waiting room during one of my father's chemotherapy sessions, I received a text message from Ryan that changed everything. No phone call, no in-person conversation, just a cold, brief message explaining that he'd realized our relationship wasn't working, that he needed space to figure out his own life, and that he thought it would be best if we didn't contact each other for a while. The timing was so cruel and unexpected that I initially assumed there had been some kind of misunderstanding. I tried calling him immediately, but he didn't answer. I sent text messages asking for clarification, for the chance to talk things through, for some explanation of what had prompted such a sudden decision. He responded only once, reiterating that he needed space and asking me to respect his decision. I drove home that evening in a state of shock and devastation, my mind reeling between worry about my father's health and complete confusion about what had happened with Ryan. When I arrived at our apartment, all of his belongings were gone. Brooklyn was there waiting for me, tears in her eyes, claiming she was as surprised and confused as I was about Ryan's sudden departure. The months following Ryan's abrupt departure were some of the darkest in my life, made bearable only by the support system I believed I could rely on. Brooklyn became my lifeline during this period, stepping into the role of devoted caregiver with such apparent selflessness that everyone in our family praised her dedication to helping me heal. She extended her stay indefinitely, insisting that I needed someone to look after me while I dealt with both my father's ongoing cancer treatment and the emotional devastation of my relationship ending so suddenly. Brooklyn took over the household completely, grocery shopping, cooking elaborate meals she claimed would help restore my appetite, and managing the practical details of daily life that felt overwhelming in my grief-stricken state. More importantly, Brooklyn became my primary emotional support during those long, painful weeks when I couldn't understand what had gone wrong with Ryan. She'd sit with me for hours while I analyzed every conversation, every interaction, every moment that might have contained clues about his growing dissatisfaction with our relationship. When I'd break down crying, convinced that I'd somehow failed as a girlfriend, Brooklyn would hold me and reassure me that Ryan's behavior said nothing about my worth as a person. Brooklyn's support extended beyond just being present during my emotional breakdowns. She actively helped me try to make sense of what had happened, offering theories and interpretations that seemed to provide the clarity I desperately needed. She suggested that Ryan had probably been feeling overwhelmed by the stress of my father's illness and had panicked about the level of commitment our relationship represented. She theorized that his artistic temperament made him afraid of being tied down to someone as responsible and goal-oriented as me. These explanations felt both painful and somehow comforting. They allowed me to believe that Ryan's departure wasn't really about fundamental flaws in my character or our compatibility, but rather about his own emotional limitations and fear of responsibility. Brooklyn's interpretations let me maintain some dignity and hope that perhaps, with time and maturity, Ryan might realize what he'd given up and find a way back to me. During this period, Brooklyn also served as my liaison with our extended family, managing the social expectations and obligations that felt impossible for me to handle directly. When relatives called to check on me, Brooklyn would answer the phone and provide updates on my emotional state, always emphasizing how hard I was trying to heal and move forward. When family gatherings approached, Brooklyn would negotiate my attendance, sometimes encouraging me to go for the sake of maintaining connections, other times protecting me from events she deemed too emotionally challenging. Our Aunt Carol, who had always been particularly close to both Brooklyn and me, became especially involved in monitoring my recovery process. Carol was our mother's youngest sister, a successful real estate agent with strong opinions about relationships and personal resilience. She'd gone through her own difficult divorce in her 30s and positioned herself as the family expert on surviving romantic heartbreak. Carol would visit regularly during the months after Ryan left, bringing care packages and offering advice based on her own experiences with betrayal and abandonment. She'd listen to my theories about what had gone wrong with Ryan, then offer her own more cynical interpretations of male behavior and relationship dynamics. According to Carol, Ryan had probably been looking for an excuse to leave for months and had simply used my family crisis as convenient timing for his escape. These conversations with Carol usually left me feeling worse rather than better, but Brooklyn would always intervene to provide more hopeful perspectives. She'd gently contradict Carol's harsh assessments of Ryan's character, insisting that people sometimes made terrible decisions during stressful periods without being fundamentally bad people. Brooklyn's more forgiving interpretation of events helped me maintain some faith in love and relationships, even as I struggled to understand why my own had ended so abruptly. My cousin Jessica, Carol's daughter, also became deeply involved in my recovery process, though her approach was completely different from either Brooklyn's nurturing support or Carol's tough love philosophy. Jessica was 2 years younger than me, recently graduated from law school, and firmly believed that the best way to get over a bad relationship was to immediately start dating other people. Jessica would arrive at my apartment armed with dating app profiles she'd created for me, outfit suggestions for hypothetical dates, and stories about her own active romantic life that were supposed to inspire me to rejoin the dating world. She meant well, but her high-energy approach to healing felt exhausting and premature. I wasn't ready to even consider dating other people when I was still trying to understand what had happened with Ryan, and Brooklyn would usually rescue me from Jessica's well-intentioned but overwhelming dating interventions, gently suggesting that I needed more time to process my emotions before jumping into new romantic situations. She'd redirect Jessica's energy toward other activities, like planning girls' nights out or organizing family dinners that would help me feel connected without the pressure of meeting new people. My grandmother Helen became another important figure during this recovery period, though her involvement came with its own complications. Grandma Helen had always favored Brooklyn and me among her many grandchildren, partly because we'd both inherited her late husband's artistic sensibilities and partly because we'd always made an effort to maintain close relationships with her. Despite our busy schedules, Grandma Helen had loved Ryan during the time I'd been dating him, charmed by his knowledge of art history and his ability to engage her in conversations about painters and cultural movements that most of the family found boring. She'd frequently mentioned how perfect Ryan seemed for me, how rare it was to find a man who appreciated both intellectual and artistic pursuits. His sudden departure confused and disappointed her almost as much as it had devastated me. During my recovery, Grandma Helen would invite Brooklyn and me for long Sunday dinners where she'd share stories about her own romantic disappointments from decades past. She'd talk about the men who had broken her heart before she met our grandfather, emphasizing how those painful experiences had ultimately led her to appreciate true love when she finally found it. These conversations were supposed to provide perspective and hope, but they often left me feeling more impatient with my own healing process. Brooklyn's interactions with Grandma Helen during these visits were particularly noteworthy in retrospect. She'd listen to our grandmother's stories with rapt attention, asking detailed questions about the men who had disappointed her and the signs she'd missed that might have predicted their eventual betrayals. Brooklyn seemed genuinely fascinated by the psychology of romantic deception, the ways people could hide their true intentions while maintaining loving, committed facades. At the time, I interpreted Brooklyn's interest in these stories as concern for my emotional education, a desire to help me develop better instincts for recognizing relationship red flags in the future. Now I understand that she was probably gathering information about manipulation tactics and the psychology of betrayal for her own purposes. Our cousin Marcus, Aunt Carol's older son and Jessica's brother, provided a completely different kind of support during my recovery. Marcus was 32, married with 2 young children, and had always been the most grounded and practical member of our extended family. He worked as an engineer, approached problems methodically, and had little patience for the dramatic emotional processing that seemed to consume the rest of us. Marcus would visit occasionally, usually bringing his wife Sarah and their kids, which forced me to focus on something other than my own problems for a few hours. He'd update me on his work projects, ask about my job performance, and generally treat me like a normal person going through a temporary setback rather than a tragic figure deserving constant sympathy and special treatment. These interactions with Marcus and Sarah were refreshing in their normalcy, but they also highlighted how much my identity had become centered around being Ryan's ex-girlfriend rather than Madison, the professional, the daughter, the cousin, the independent woman with her own goals and interests. Brooklyn's constant focus on my emotional state, while well-intentioned, had inadvertently encouraged me to define myself primarily through my romantic loss rather than my other qualities and achievements. Sarah, Marcus's wife, was particularly insightful about relationship dynamics, having navigated her own share of dating disappointments before meeting Marcus. She'd occasionally offer observations about my situation that were more nuanced than the advice I was getting from other family members. Sarah suggested that Ryan's departure might actually have been a blessing in disguise, revealing incompatibilities that would have caused bigger problems later in our relationship. More importantly, Sarah was the first person to gently suggest that I might be spending too much time analyzing what had gone wrong with Ryan and not enough time focusing on what I wanted for my future. She encouraged me to think about the kind of partner I actually needed, rather than fixating on the partner I'd lost. These conversations with Sarah planted seeds of self-reflection that would eventually help me move beyond my obsession with understanding Ryan's motivations. Brooklyn's reaction to Sarah's influence was subtle but noticeable. She'd often interrupt conversations between Sarah and me, redirecting discussions away from future-focused topics and back toward processing my feelings about Ryan. Brooklyn would suggest that rushing toward closure without fully understanding what had happened would prevent me from learning important lessons about relationships and self-protection. Looking back, I can see that Brooklyn was actively working to keep me emotionally stuck in the aftermath of Ryan's departure. At the time, her behavior seemed like protective concern, an attempt to ensure I didn't make impulsive decisions before I was truly ready to move forward. Now I understand that keeping me focused on Ryan served Brooklyn's purposes in ways I couldn't have imagined. The family dynamics during this period created a perfect environment for Brooklyn to establish herself as my primary caretaker and emotional authority. Everyone praised her selfless dedication to helping me heal, her willingness to put her own life on hold to support me through such a difficult time. Brooklyn basked in this approval, positioning herself as the family member who truly understood love, loyalty, and the importance of supporting people through their darkest moments. Meanwhile, I became increasingly dependent on Brooklyn's interpretations of my experiences and emotions. She'd help me understand why I was feeling confused, sad, or angry on any given day. She'd validate my theories about what Ryan might be thinking or feeling. She'd encourage me to trust my instincts while simultaneously shaping those instincts. Through her own commentary and observations, this dynamic established a pattern where Brooklyn held significant influence over my emotional life and decision-making processes. I learned to value her opinions above my own intuition, to seek her approval before making choices about my social life, my career, and eventually my dating life when I finally felt ready to consider new relationships. 2 years after Ryan's departure. When I met David at a professional conference, Brooklyn was the first person I told about the attraction I felt toward him. She was the one who helped me decide whether to accept his invitation for coffee, who analyzed our early conversations for signs of genuine interest versus polite friendliness, who advised me on how quickly to return his calls and texts. Brooklyn's involvement in the beginning of my relationship with David seemed natural and helpful given the support she'd provided during my recovery from Ryan. I trusted her judgment about people and relationships. believing that her devotion during my darkest period had earned her a permanent role as my relationship advisor and emotional confidant. What I couldn't have known was that Brooklyn's intense involvement in my emotional life wasn't motivated by love and concern, but by guilt and strategic planning. She'd been maintaining a careful balance, providing enough genuine support to maintain my trust and dependence while simultaneously laying groundwork for betrayals I couldn't have imagined. When David and I got married 18 months after meeting, Brooklyn was instrumental in planning our wedding, but looking back now, I can identify the first subtle signs that something was shifting in her behavior toward me and my relationship. During our engagement period, Brooklyn had been nothing but enthusiastic about David, praising his stability, his kindness, and how obviously happy he made me. She'd helped me choose my dress, coordinated with vendors, and even gave a beautiful maid of honor speech about how David was everything Ryan hadn't been. But within months of our marriage, Brooklyn's commentary about my relationship began to change in ways so gradual that I didn't notice the pattern until much later. She'd make small observations about David's moods, his work stress, or his interactions with our family that seemed innocent enough but contained subtle implications that something might be wrong beneath the surface of our apparent happiness. The first incident I can clearly remember happened about 4 months after our wedding. David and I had hosted a small dinner party for some of our friends, and Brooklyn had attended as our single guest who we hoped might connect with David's unmarried coworker, Tom. The evening had gone well, with good conversation, plenty of laughter, and what seemed like genuine interest between Brooklyn and Tom. The next morning, Brooklyn called to thank me for including her and to discuss how much she'd enjoyed meeting everyone. But then she mentioned, almost casually, that she'd noticed David seemed tired during the party, and she wondered if he was feeling overwhelmed by the social obligations that came with marriage. She suggested that some men struggled with the transition from bachelor life to married life, even when they genuinely loved their wives. At the time, her observation seemed like caring concern from someone who knew me well and wanted to ensure my happiness. David had been working long hours on a challenging project, so it made sense that he might seem tired at social events. I appreciated Brooklyn's attentiveness to details I might have missed due to my own involvement in hosting duties, but this pattern continued and escalated over the following months. Brooklyn would attend family gatherings and later comment on David's interactions with relatives, suggesting that he seemed uncomfortable or distant. She'd notice when David checked his phone during conversations and wonder aloud whether work was becoming too much of a priority in our marriage. She'd observe that David didn't seem as affectionate in public as he had during our dating period and question whether married life was meeting his expectations. Each individual observation seemed reasonable and came from a place of apparent concern for my well-being. Brooklyn would always frame her comments as questions rather than accusations, wondering rather than declaring, suggesting that she might be wrong but wanted to share her impressions in case they were helpful. Her tone was always gentle, loving, and focused on protecting me from potential problems I might not be seeing clearly myself. Simultaneously, Brooklyn began sharing more details about her own dating life and romantic philosophy that seemed designed to create contrast with my married situation. She described the passionate intensity of her relationships with artists, musicians, and entrepreneurs, emphasizing the excitement and unpredictability that characterized her romantic connections. She'd talk about men who wrote her poetry, surprised her with spontaneous trips, and maintained the kind of romantic intensity that supposedly diminished in long-term committed relationships. These stories weren't presented as criticism of my marriage, but rather as celebration of different relationship styles and life choices. Brooklyn would emphasize that she envied the security and stability that David provided, while also sharing experiences that highlighted the adventure and passion that marriage supposedly couldn't sustain. She'd mention how refreshing it was to date someone new who still saw her as mysterious and exciting, then quickly add that of course married couples developed different but equally valuable forms of intimacy. The implicit message in these conversations was that marriage required sacrificing certain types of romantic excitement in exchange for security and predictability. Brooklyn would never directly suggest that I was missing out on anything, but her stories created a constant backdrop of comparison that gradually made my relationship with David seem ordinary and less thrilling than the alternatives. Around our first wedding anniversary, Brooklyn's observations about David began to include more specific concerns about our compatibility and communication patterns. She'd mentioned that she'd noticed David seemed to shut down during family discussions about emotional topics, suggesting that he might struggle with the kind of deep emotional intimacy that lasting marriages required. She'd observed that David and I had different communication styles and wonder whether we'd developed effective ways to work through disagreements. These concerns felt more serious than her previous casual observations, and they began to plant seeds of doubt that I found difficult to dismiss. Marriage was still relatively new to me, and I was naturally concerned about building a strong foundation for our long-term happiness. when Brooklyn suggested that certain patterns in our relationship might indicate deeper compatibility issues. I started paying closer attention to David's behavior in our interactions. This increased scrutiny of my marriage created a self-fulfilling prophecy where I began to notice and magnify small issues that might have otherwise resolved naturally. When David was quiet during dinner, I wondered if he was withdrawing emotionally rather than simply being tired from work. When we had minor disagreements about household responsibilities or social plans, I questioned whether these conflicts revealed fundamental differences in our values and priorities. Brooklyn encouraged this analytical approach to my relationship, suggesting that awareness of potential problems was the first step toward addressing them before they became serious threats to our marriage. She'd recommend books about communication in marriage, articles about maintaining intimacy during the early years of marriage, and workshops that might help David and me strengthen our connection. On the surface, this advice seemed supportive and constructive. Brooklyn was helping me become a more intentional and thoughtful wife, someone who actively worked to build a strong marriage rather than passively hoping everything would work out. But the underlying effect was to create constant anxiety about the state of my relationship and doubt about David's commitment and satisfaction. The most insidious aspect of Brooklyn's influence during this period was how she managed to position herself as both the source of my concerns about my marriage and the primary resource for addressing those concerns. She'd point out potential problems, then offer solutions. She'd create doubt, then provide reassurance. She'd suggest that my marriage needed work, then volunteer to help me figure out how to improve it. This dynamic made me increasingly dependent on Brooklyn's perspective and advice about my own relationship, rather than trusting my instincts or communicating directly with David about any concerns I might have. I began filtering my experiences through Brooklyn's interpretations and recommendations. She became the expert on my marriage, the person who could see things I was too close to notice and provide guidance I was too inexperienced to develop independently. Meanwhile, Brooklyn's own romantic life became increasingly dramatic and consuming. She'd started dating a photographer named Jake who traveled frequently for work and maintained what Brooklyn described as an open approach to commitment. Their relationship involved passionate reunions after weeks apart, intense emotional conversations about art and creativity, and the kind of uncertainty that Brooklyn claimed kept their connection exciting and authentic. Brooklyn would share detailed stories about her relationship with Jake, emphasizing how different it was from traditional committed relationships like mine. She described nights spent in art studios until dawn, spontaneous road trips to music festivals, and conversations that lasted for hours without touching on practical topics like finances, household management, or future planning. These stories served multiple purposes in our conversations. They reinforced the idea that passionate, exciting relationships required a certain level of instability and uncertainty. They suggested that the security and predictability of marriage came at the cost of romantic intensity and personal growth. And they positioned Brooklyn as someone who prioritized authentic emotional connection over social expectations and conventional relationship models. More subtly, Brooklyn's relationship stories began to include references to Jake's perspectives on marriage and long-term commitment. According to Brooklyn, Jake believed that traditional marriage often killed authentic intimacy by creating obligation and routine where spontaneous connection had once existed. He supposedly argued that truly compatible couples didn't need legal and social structures to maintain their bond, and that married people often stayed together out of habit and convenience rather than genuine passion. These philosophical discussions about the nature of commitment and authentic relationships felt intellectually stimulating and emotionally challenging. Brooklyn would present Jake's perspectives as interesting alternative viewpoints rather than direct criticism of my choices, but the cumulative effect was to create doubt about whether marriage could sustain the kind of deep, passionate connection I wanted in a romantic relationship. During this same period, Brooklyn began sharing concerns that other family members had supposedly expressed about my marriage. She'd mentioned that Aunt Carol had noticed I seemed more stressed lately and wondered if married life was more challenging than I'd expected. She'd report that our cousin Jessica had asked whether David was as social and outgoing as I needed in a partner. She'd relay Grandma Helen's observations about how different David and I seemed in terms of our interests and energy levels. These secondhand concerns felt more objective and serious than Brooklyn's own observations because they came from multiple family members who cared about my happiness. When Brooklyn suggested that people who loved me were noticing potential problems in my marriage, it became much harder to dismiss their concerns as misperceptions or overthinking. What I didn't realize at the time was that Brooklyn was actively creating these family concerns through her own conversations with relatives. She'd plant seeds of doubt by mentioning her own observations about my marriage, then later report back to me that these same relatives had independently expressed similar concerns. This circular pattern made it seem like multiple people were noticing problems in my relationship when in reality, Brooklyn was the original source of all the concerns being circulated through our family network, the crescendo of this mounting tension came about 6 months ago when Brooklyn suggested that she was worried enough about my marriage to consider having a serious conversation with David himself. She'd been noticing what she described as increasing signs that he was dissatisfied with married life, and she wondered if he might benefit from talking to someone outside our immediate relationship about his concerns and expectations. This suggestion terrified me because it implied that my marriage was in serious enough trouble to require intervention from family members. Brooklyn assured me that she would approach any conversation with David carefully and supportively, focusing on helping him communicate more effectively with me rather than criticizing his behavior or our relationship. The fact that Brooklyn was willing to potentially risk her relationship with David for the sake of protecting my marriage seemed to demonstrate the depth of her concern and love for me. I was touched by her willingness to have uncomfortable conversations if it might help save my relationship, even though I ultimately decided that David and I should work through our issues ourselves rather than involving family members in our private struggles. Looking back now, I can see that Brooklyn's offer to intervene directly with David was probably an attempt to gain access to information about his thoughts and feelings that she could then use to further undermine our relationship. But at the time, it seemed like the ultimate proof of her loyalty and commitment to my happiness, someone willing to risk awkwardness and potential conflict for the sake of protecting someone she loved. The confrontation with my grandmother about Brooklyn's campaign against my marriage had left me reeling, but I knew I needed more information before I could fully understand what had been happening. Over the next week, I carefully reached out to different family members, not to accuse Brooklyn directly, but to understand what stories had been circulating about David and me. The conversations were more devastating than I could have imagined. Aunt Carol revealed that Brooklyn had told her I'd been staying late at work several nights a week, supposedly to avoid going home to David. She'd suggested that I might be having an emotional affair with a colleague, pointing to what she claimed were changes in my appearance and mood as evidence of romantic involvement with someone other than my husband. Cousin Jessica admitted that Brooklyn had expressed concerns about David's commitment to our marriage, claiming she'd overheard phone conversations where he complained about feeling trapped and uncertain about his decision to marry so young. According to Brooklyn's version of events, David had supposedly confided in her during family gatherings about feeling pressured into marriage before he was ready to settle down. Marcus shared the most disturbing revelation of all. Brooklyn had told him that she was considering staging an intervention because she believed both David and I were too proud to admit our marriage was failing. She'd supposedly gathered evidence of our problems from multiple sources and was debating whether to present this information to our parents or to David's family in an attempt to force us to seek counseling. Each conversation revealed new layers of Brooklyn's deception, but they also showed me how carefully she'd crafted her lies to seem plausible and concerning rather than malicious. She'd never claimed to have witnessed anything directly inappropriate. Instead, she'd built her case through implications, observations, and supposed conversations that couldn't be verified or contradicted. The most sophisticated aspect of Brooklyn's campaign was how she'd positioned herself as reluctant to share these concerns, claiming to be torn between loyalty to me and worry about my well-being. Family members described her as visibly distressed when discussing my marriage, someone who was clearly struggling with whether to intervene or respect my privacy. This apparent internal conflict made her seem more credible and sympathetic rather than gossipy or manipulative. Armed with this information, I decided to confront Brooklyn directly, but I wanted to do it strategically rather than emotionally. I needed to understand not just what she'd been doing, but why she'd been doing it, and whether there was any possibility that her actions came from genuine concern rather than malicious intent. I invited Brooklyn to lunch at a quiet restaurant, where we could talk privately without interruption. I'd planned to approach the conversation carefully, giving her opportunities to explain her behavior and possibly even apologize if she recognized the harm she'd caused. What I wasn't prepared for was how confidently and skillfully she would defend her actions. When I brought up the concerns that family members had shared with me, Brooklyn's initial reaction was surprise and hurt that I would question her motivations. She explained that everything she'd shared with relatives came from genuine worry about my happiness and concern that I was ignoring warning signs about my marriage. She claimed that as someone who loved me unconditionally, she felt obligated to pay attention to details I might miss due to my emotional investment in making my relationship work. Brooklyn insisted that her observations about David's behavior and our marital dynamics were accurate, even if they were painful for me to hear. She pointed out that she'd been present during many family gatherings where she'd witnessed interactions between David and me that suggested underlying tension or dissatisfaction. She argued that as my closest friend and cousin, she was in a unique position to notice changes in my behavior and mood that might indicate problems I was hiding from myself. Most manipulatively, Brooklyn suggested that my anger about her sharing these concerns with family members proved that I knew, deep down, that her observations were accurate. She claimed that truly happily married people wouldn't be threatened by outside perspective or family input about their relationships. My defensive reaction to her concerns supposedly demonstrated that I was aware of problems in my marriage but was too proud or scared to address them directly. This conversation was my first real glimpse of Brooklyn's psychological sophistication and her ability to turn accusations back on the accuser. Rather than apologizing or acknowledging that she might have overstepped boundaries, she reframed my confrontation as evidence that she was right to be concerned about me. She made me feel like I was attacking someone who loved me for trying to protect me from a situation I was too close to see clearly. The lunch ended with Brooklyn tearfully insisting that she would stop sharing her concerns with family members. If that's what I wanted, but she couldn't promise to stop worrying about me or noticing things that suggested my marriage wasn't as strong as I believed. She made me feel guilty for silencing someone who claimed to care about my well-being, even as part of me recognized that something about her explanation didn't feel entirely honest. That evening, I decided to have a direct conversation with David about the stories Brooklyn had been telling about our marriage. This was perhaps the most difficult conversation of our relationship because it required me to admit that I'd allowed family interference to create doubt about our connection without ever discussing these concerns with him directly. David's reaction to learning about Brooklyn's campaign was immediate anger followed by genuine confusion about where these perceptions of our marriage could have originated. He confirmed that he'd never complained to Brooklyn about feeling trapped or uncertain about our marriage. He pointed out that many of the private conversations she'd supposedly overheard couldn't have happened because he rarely spent time alone with Brooklyn during family gatherings. More importantly, David helped me recognize how differently he and I had been experiencing our marriage compared to the narrative Brooklyn had constructed. While I'd been worrying about subtle signs of his dissatisfaction, he'd been feeling grateful for the stability and partnership we'd built together. While I'd been analyzing his moods and behavior for evidence of problems, he'd been appreciating how well we complemented each other's strengths and supported each other's goals. The conversation with David revealed that Brooklyn's lies hadn't just damaged my relationships with family members. They'd also infected my ability to trust my own perceptions and experiences within my marriage. I'd been so focused on watching for signs of the problems Brooklyn claimed to see that I'd stopped appreciating the genuine strengths and happiness that actually characterized my relationship with David. David's response to the situation was both supportive and protective. He suggested that we establish clearer boundaries with Brooklyn regarding her involvement in our marriage and her access to private information about our relationship. He also recommended that we proactively address the false narrative she'd created by having honest conversations with family members about the actual state of our marriage. Most importantly, David helped me understand that Brooklyn's behavior represented a violation of trust that couldn't be easily repaired through explanation or apology. Regardless of her claimed motivations, she deliberately undermined my marriage and damaged my relationships with people who cared about me. The sophistication and persistence of her campaign suggested calculation rather than concern. The next phase of my confrontation with Brooklyn came when I decided to test her honesty by sharing false information to see how she would handle it. I told her that David and I had been having serious conversations about separation, that we were considering couples counseling, and that I was beginning to think she might have been right about the problems in our marriage. Brooklyn's response to this fabricated crisis was revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Rather than showing genuine concern or offering to help repair the problems she'd supposedly identified, she seemed almost excited by the confirmation that her concerns had been justified. She immediately began offering advice about separation logistics, recommendations for divorce attorneys, and suggestions about how to protect my financial interests during a potential split. More tellingly, Brooklyn began sharing stories about other couples she knew who had divorced after marriages that had seemed stable from the outside. She emphasized how much happier these people had become after ending relationships that weren't truly fulfilling, and she suggested that sometimes the kindest thing couples could do was admit incompatibility before investing more years in partnerships that couldn't provide authentic satisfaction. This response convinced me that Brooklyn's campaign against my marriage hadn't been motivated by concern for my happiness, but by a desire to see my relationship fail. Someone who genuinely cared about my well-being would have been devastated to learn that their worst fears about my marriage were coming true. Brooklyn's barely concealed satisfaction at the supposed confirmation of her predictions revealed that she'd been hoping for exactly this outcome. The final piece of the confrontation puzzle came when I decided to investigate Brooklyn's own recent activities and relationships. I'd been so focused on defending my marriage against her attacks that I hadn't paid attention to what was happening in her personal life during the months she'd been systematically undermining mine. When I asked mutual friends about Brooklyn's dating situation, I learned that she'd been seeing someone regularly for several months but had been unusually secretive about his identity and the nature of their relationship. Unlike her previous romantic involvements, which she'd always discussed openly and enthusiastically, this relationship was being conducted with privacy that seemed uncharacteristic for someone who typically shared intimate details about her love life. The secrecy surrounding Brooklyn's current relationship struck me as suspicious, particularly given the timing that coincided with her campaign against my marriage. I began to wonder whether her attempts to create problems between David and me might be connected to her own romantic situation in ways I hadn't previously considered. This suspicion led me to pay closer attention to Brooklyn's behavior and schedule, looking for patterns that might provide clues about her mysterious boyfriend's identity. I noticed that she'd become unavailable for family gatherings and social events with increasing frequency, always citing vague prior commitments that she declined to describe in detail. More significantly, I realized that Brooklyn's phone behavior had changed dramatically over recent months. She'd always been someone who answered calls and texts immediately, but lately she'd been protective of her phone, keeping it face down during conversations and stepping away to respond to messages privately. This shift felt particularly notable given her history of sharing every detail of her romantic relationships with family and friends. The combination of her secretive behavior and the timing of her attacks on my marriage created a growing suspicion that Brooklyn's current relationship might somehow be connected to her desire to destroy mine. While I couldn't yet prove any connection, the pattern of behavior suggested that her campaign against David and me served purposes beyond the concern for my well-being that she claimed as her motivation. This realization transformed my understanding of the entire situation. Brooklyn's lies about my marriage weren't just misguided concern or family interference. They were strategic actions designed to achieve specific goals that had nothing to do with protecting me and everything to do with advancing her own interests. The question that remained was what those interests might be and how my marriage's destruction would serve her purposes. The confrontation phase of this crisis had revealed the depth and sophistication of Brooklyn's deception, but it had also shown me that the situation was far more complex and calculated than I'd initially understood. Rather than dealing with family drama caused by misunderstanding or poor judgment, I was facing a deliberate campaign of lies designed to achieve outcomes that Brooklyn had never honestly acknowledged or explained. This recognition marked the beginning of my transition from hurt confusion to angry determination. I was no longer focused on repairing relationships or understanding motivations. I was committed to uncovering the truth about Brooklyn's actions and protecting my marriage from further damage. The confrontation had ended, but the real investigation was just beginning. The investigation that followed my confrontation with Brooklyn required a level of strategic thinking I'd never had to employ in family relationships before. I realized that Brooklyn had been operating several steps ahead of me for months, carefully constructing lies and managing information flow throughout our family network. If I wanted to uncover the truth about her motivations and actions, I needed to become equally calculated in my approach. My first step was to create a detailed timeline of Brooklyn's campaign against my marriage, cross-referencing her claims with actual events and conversations I could verify. I went through old text messages, social media posts, and calendar entries, looking for discrepancies between what Brooklyn claimed to have witnessed and what had actually happened during family gatherings and social events. The timeline revealed patterns that were even more disturbing than I'd initially realized. Brooklyn's negative observations about David and our marriage had consistently coincided with periods when she was absent from family events or had limited interaction with us. She'd been reporting detailed conversations and behavioral observations from gatherings she hadn't attended or situations where she'd had minimal contact with David. More significantly, I discovered that Brooklyn's campaign had intensified dramatically around the time she'd supposedly broken up with Jake, the photographer she'd been dating. According to her own social media activity and the stories she'd shared with family, her relationship with Jake had ended about 4 months ago. This timing aligned almost perfectly with the escalation of her concerns about my marriage, from general observations to specific accusations about infidelity and fundamental incompatibility. Armed with this timeline, I began conducting more targeted investigations into Brooklyn's recent activities and relationships. I reached out to mutual friends who might have information about her current dating situation, carefully framing my questions as casual interest rather than suspicious investigation. What I learned was both shocking and illuminating. Brooklyn hadn't actually broken up with Jake 4 months ago. Instead, she'd begun seeing someone new while still involved with Jake, creating a complicated romantic situation that she'd kept hidden from family and most friends. The secrecy surrounding her current relationship suddenly made perfect sense. When I understood that she was potentially cheating on her existing boyfriend, the identity of Brooklyn's secret boyfriend remained mysterious. But I gathered enough information to understand that he was someone from her past, someone she'd reconnected with recently, and someone whose involvement with her needed to be kept private for reasons that went beyond simple preference for privacy. This Discovery prompted me to reconsider every aspect of Brooklyn's behavior over recent months. Her increased unavailability for family events, her secretive phone behavior, and her intense focus on undermining my marriage all took on new meaning when I understood that she was juggling a complicated romantic situation that required significant time and emotional energy to manage. More importantly, I began to suspect that Brooklyn's attacks on my marriage might be serving as a distraction from her own relationship drama. By positioning herself as the concerned family member trying to save my failing marriage, she'd created a narrative that explained her distraction, her emotional intensity, and her frequent absences as noble self-sacrifice rather than personal preoccupation with her own romantic complications. The breakthrough in my investigation came when I decided to follow Brooklyn discreetly to see where she was spending the time she claimed to be devoting to work projects and personal commitments. I felt guilty about essentially spying on my cousin, but her systematic lies about my marriage had destroyed my ability to trust anything she told me without verification. The first time I followed Brooklyn, she led me to an upscale apartment complex across town where she spent several hours on a Tuesday afternoon. I waited in my car, uncertain whether she was visiting friends, working on a project, or meeting her mysterious boyfriend. When she emerged, she was accompanied by a tall man with dark hair who walked her to her car and kissed her goodbye in a way that suggested intimate familiarity. From a distance, something about the man seemed familiar, but I couldn't identify him clearly enough to understand why he triggered a sense of recognition. The interaction was brief, and Brooklyn drove away without noticing my presence in the parking lot. But the encounter confirmed that she was indeed involved with someone she was keeping secret from family and friends. I documented this encounter with photos and notes, beginning to build evidence of Brooklyn's deception that extended far beyond her lies about my marriage. If she was willing to lie about her own relationship status while simultaneously attacking mine, it suggested a level of manipulation and strategic thinking that was deeply concerning. The second time I followed Brooklyn, the truth hit me like a physical blow. She led me to the same apartment complex, but this time when her companion emerged to walk her to her car, I had a clear view of his face. It was Ryan, my ex-boyfriend, the man who had broken my heart 3 years ago by disappearing from my life. Without explanation or closure, seeing Brooklyn with Ryan felt like being punched in the stomach and struck by lightning simultaneously. Every piece of the puzzle suddenly fell into place with devastating clarity. Brooklyn's campaign against my marriage hadn't been motivated by concern for my well-being or even jealousy of my happiness. It had been a calculated strategy to clear the path for her relationship with Ryan by destroying my credibility and potentially ending my marriage. The sophistication of Brooklyn's plan became apparent as I sat in my car, watching her laugh with the man who had once broken my heart so completely. She'd been systematically undermining my marriage while secretly reconnecting with my ex-boyfriend, creating a situation where she could eventually reveal their relationship without appearing to betray me if I was already divorced or separated from David. More insidiously, Brooklyn had been gathering information about my marriage and my emotional vulnerabilities through her role as my trusted confidant, then sharing this information with Ryan. Every conversation I'd had with her about my relationship with David, every doubt I'd expressed about marriage, every private moment I'd shared thinking I was talking to my closest family member, had potentially been relayed to the man who had already betrayed me once before. The cruelty of this realization was almost unbearable. Brooklyn hadn't just been lying to our family about my marriage, she'd been violating my trust in the most fundamental way possible by sharing my private thoughts and feelings with someone who had no right to that information. She'd used my openness and vulnerability against me, weaponizing my own words and emotions to justify her betrayal. I remained in the parking lot for nearly an hour after Brooklyn and Ryan disappeared into his apartment, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about family drama or romantic competition, it was about someone I'd trusted completely systematically destroying my reputation and relationships to serve her own purposes. The drive home was surreal, as if I was seeing my entire life through a completely different lens. Every interaction I'd had with Brooklyn over the past year took on new meaning when I understood that she'd been building a relationship with Ryan while simultaneously trying to destroy mine with David. Every family gathering where she'd made subtle observations about my marriage had potentially been followed by private conversations with Ryan where she'd shared intimate details about my life and relationship. Most painfully, I realized that Brooklyn's support during my recovery from Ryan's departure hadn't been genuine compassion but rather guilt management and information gathering. She'd probably known why Ryan had left me so suddenly, and she'd used her position as my comforter to ensure that I didn't discover the truth about their connection. When I arrived home, David immediately noticed my emotional state and asked what had happened. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt grateful for his steady presence and unconditional support. After hours of revelations about betrayal and manipulation, coming home to someone who genuinely loved and respected me felt like emerging from a nightmare into safety. I told David everything I discovered, from Brooklyn's lies about our marriage to her secret relationship with Ryan. His reaction was immediate anger on my behalf, followed by protective concern about how this revelation was affecting me emotionally. David's response reminded me of what authentic love and loyalty looked like, providing a stark contrast to the calculating manipulation I'd been experiencing from Brooklyn. Together, David and I developed a plan for how to handle this situation. Moving forward, we agreed that Brooklyn needed to be confronted with evidence of her deception, but we wanted to do it strategically rather than emotionally. We also decided that our family needed to understand the truth about Brooklyn's lies and her motivations for spreading them. Most importantly, David helped me recognize that this discovery, while painful, had actually strengthened our marriage by forcing us to communicate more directly and honestly than we ever had before. Brooklyn's attempts to create doubt and suspicion between us had ultimately resulted in deeper trust and more open communication. Her lies had failed to destroy our relationship and had instead revealed its fundamental strength. The next phase of dealing with this crisis involved carefully planning how to expose Brooklyn's deception without causing unnecessary drama or harm to family relationships that weren't directly involved in her manipulation. We wanted justice and accountability, but we also wanted to handle the situation with dignity and maturity that would reflect well on our own character and judgment. David suggested that we gather additional evidence before confronting Brooklyn directly, ensuring that we had documentation of her lies and proof of her relationship with Ryan that couldn't be disputed or explained away. This approach felt both practical and emotionally satisfying, giving me agency and control in a situation where I'd been a victim of manipulation for months. We also discussed how this experience had changed my understanding of trust, family relationships, and the importance of direct communication in marriage. While Brooklyn's betrayal had been devastating, it had also taught me valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation, protecting my relationships from outside interference, and trusting my own perceptions rather than allowing others to interpret my experiences for me. The transformation I underwent during this period was profound and lasting. I evolved from someone who trusted family members unconditionally and sought external validation for my relationship decisions to someone who understood the importance of boundaries, skepticism, and independent judgment. Brooklyn's betrayal had hurt me deeply, but it had also made me stronger and more discerning in ways that would benefit me for the rest of my life. The final confrontation with Brooklyn came 2 weeks after I discovered her relationship with Ryan. David and I had spent that time gathering additional evidence and preparing emotionally for what would likely be the end of my relationship with someone I'd considered my closest family member. We arranged a family dinner at our house, inviting Brooklyn, our parents, Aunt Carol, Jessica, Marcus, and Grandma Helen. I framed it as a celebration of David's recent promotion, and Brooklyn accepted enthusiastically, probably seeing it as another opportunity to monitor my marriage. After dinner, I stood up to address the group. I explained that we'd discovered false information about our marriage had been circulating through our family for months. I shared specific examples of the lies Brooklyn had told, including claims about David's dissatisfaction, my supposed infidelity, and our alleged plans for separation. Brooklyn initially maintained her innocent facade, claiming she'd only shared genuine concerns. That's when I presented our evidence. The timeline showing her claims didn't align with her actual presence at family events, social media screenshots contradicting her stories, and most devastatingly, photographs of her with Ryan outside his apartment. The family's reaction was immediate and intense. Brooklyn's defense crumbled when confronted with undeniable proof. She admitted to rekindling her relationship with Ryan but claimed it happened after she'd begun noticing problems in my marriage. David addressed Brooklyn directly, calmly explaining how her lies had affected our marriage, creating doubt where none had existed. He made clear that her actions had caused real harm to people who'd never deserved such treatment. The conversation ended with Brooklyn being asked to leave and given clear expectations about future family contact. Our relatives established new guidelines for sharing concerns directly rather than through third parties. 6 months later, Brooklyn sent a letter attempting to apologize. She revealed that her relationship with Ryan had actually begun shortly after he'd broken up with me 3 years earlier, meaning her support during my recovery had been performed while she was secretly involved with the person who'd caused my heartbreak. According to her letter, Ryan had reached out within weeks of ending our relationship. She described months of internal conflict, portraying her lies about my marriage as mistakes born from guilt rather than calculated manipulation. The letter included requests for forgiveness and suggestions for rebuilding our relationship with David. And I chose not to respond directly but shared the letter with affected family members. Brooklyn's ongoing contact with Ryan made any reconciliation feel unsafe and inadvisable. This experience fundamentally changed how I approach relationships and boundaries. I learned to trust my own perceptions rather than allowing others to interpret my experiences. The crisis strengthened my marriage with David by forcing us to communicate more directly and develop a united front against outside interference. The professional implications were significant. Skills I developed for investigating Brooklyn's lies translated into workplace confidence. I became better at analyzing competing claims and building coalitions with honest colleagues. Within a year, I was promoted to senior project management, with the confidence gained from handling this personal betrayal giving me courage for professional challenges. Our approach to social relationships changed dramatically. We became more selective about our inner circle while nurturing relationships with people who demonstrated consistent honesty. We established new boundaries around family interactions, making conscious choices about engagement based on relatives' track records of respect and trustworthiness. The experience motivated us to invest in financial independence, recognizing that economic vulnerability could make us susceptible to manipulation. We worked with a financial advisor to build wealth and create freedom to make relationship decisions based on values rather than necessity. David and I began couples therapy, not because our marriage was in crisis, but to process the experience thoroughly and develop stronger communication skills. We learned about manipulation tactics, attachment styles, and strategies for recognizing deception in the future. The community impact was broader than expected. As word spread about how we'd handled Brooklyn's deception, other couples reached out for advice about similar situations. We began facilitating support groups for people dealing with family manipulation, discovering these dynamics were more common than we'd realized. Our advocacy work evolved into professional consulting, helping organizations address workplace manipulation and improve communication cultures. We co-authored a bestseller about family manipulation and relationship recovery, reaching thousands of people struggling with similar betrayals. We established a scholarship fund in Grandma Helen's name, supporting young people pursuing education in psychology and conflict resolution. The scholarship recipients often share their own stories, creating an ongoing community committed to breaking cycles of manipulation. Looking back 5 years later, Brooklyn's betrayal ultimately led to positive changes in every area of my life. My marriage is stronger, friendships more authentic, professional confidence higher, and understanding of human nature more realistic and helpful. The most valuable lesson is that surviving betrayal requires both emotional intelligence and practical skills. It's not enough to process hurt feelings. You need concrete abilities for recognizing manipulation, setting boundaries, and building support networks. If you're dealing with someone who claims to care while systematically undermining your confidence or relationships, trust your instincts. Investigate their claims and motivations. People who truly love you will welcome transparency and accountability, while manipulators will resist scrutiny and make you feel guilty for questioning them. Remember that authentic love supports your growth, celebrates your successes, and respects your autonomy. Anyone who consistently creates doubt or confusion while claiming to have your best interests at heart is probably serving their own agenda. The relationship with Brooklyn remains severed, and I've made peace with that likelihood. Some betrayals are too fundamental to overcome, particularly when the person shows no genuine remorse. However, surviving such betrayal can lead to stronger, more authentic relationships with people who prove themselves worthy of trust. The experience taught me to value honesty over harmony, direct communication over diplomatic silence, and genuine loyalty over performed caring. Today, David and I have been married for 3 years, and our relationship has never been stronger. We've learned to protect our marriage from outside interference while remaining open to genuine support from people who've earned our trust through consistent actions. We've used this experience to help other couples recognize manipulation within their family dynamics. The skills we developed for identifying lies, gathering evidence, and confronting deception have proven valuable for friends facing similar challenges. The strength you'll gain from successfully identifying and addressing manipulation will serve you forever, making you more confident, discerning, and capable of building relationships that truly support your happiness and growth. Our story serves as a reminder that surviving betrayal isn't just about healing from immediate harm, but about using the experience to build stronger, more authentic relationships and developing skills to recognize manipulation before it causes serious damage. Trust people who welcome transparency and question those who resist scrutiny. Protecting your well-being in authentic relationships isn't selfish but necessary for building the kind of life that truly serves your highest good. The people who truly care about you will support your growth, celebrate your success, and stand with you when facing challenges, while those who would manipulate you will reveal themselves through their resistance to accountability. Trust your instincts, verify important claims, and surround yourself with people whose actions consistently match their words. The foundation of authentic love, honesty, respect, and genuine concern for each other's well-being. will always withstand external threats and internal challenges when both people are committed to truth and growth. The immediate aftermath of exposing Brooklyn's lies created ripple effects throughout our extended social circle that I hadn't anticipated. Friends who had heard fragments of Brooklyn's stories about my marriage began reaching out to apologize for believing false information and to offer their genuine support. These conversations revealed how far Brooklyn's campaign had spread beyond our immediate family. My college roommate Michelle called me in tears after hearing what had happened. She admitted that Brooklyn had contacted her months earlier, expressing concern about my mental health and suggesting that I was struggling with depression related to marital problems. Michelle had been planning to stage her own intervention. Before learning the truth about Brooklyn's motivations, the revelation that Brooklyn had been contacting my friends independently, using her position as my cousin to gain credibility for her lies, added another layer of violation to her betrayal. She hadn't just been manipulating family members. She'd been systematically building a network of people who believed I was in crisis and needed help. This discovery led David and me to conduct a more comprehensive investigation of Brooklyn's activities. We reached out to mutual acquaintances, former classmates, and even some of David's colleagues who had met Brooklyn at social events. The pattern that emerged was shocking in its scope and sophistication. Brooklyn had been carefully crafting different versions of her story for different audiences, always positioning herself as the concerned family member who was trying to help, but didn't know what to do. She told my college friends that I was struggling with mental health issues. She told David's colleagues that our marriage was strained by financial problems. She told family members that I was potentially having an affair. Each story was tailored to the audience's relationship with me and their likely concerns. The consistency in her approach suggested that this wasn't impulsive behavior but rather a calculated campaign designed to isolate me from potential sources of support while building sympathy for herself as someone dealing with a troubled family member. The professional counselor we eventually consulted helped us understand that Brooklyn's behavior fit patterns typically seen in cases of pathological manipulation. The counselor explained that people who engage in this type of systematic deception often do so because they've learned to use other people's emotions and relationships as tools for achieving their own goals. Understanding the psychology behind Brooklyn's actions helped me process the betrayal without taking it personally. Her willingness to destroy my reputation and relationships wasn't really about me. It was about her own psychological needs and her inability to pursue what she wanted through honest means. The healing process involved not just recovering from the immediate harm Brooklyn had caused, but also developing a more sophisticated understanding of human nature and relationship dynamics. I learned to recognize the difference between people who make mistakes and people who systematically choose deception as a strategy for getting what they want. David's family's reaction to our situation provided an interesting contrast to the drama we'd experienced with my relatives. His parents and siblings were horrified by what Brooklyn had done and immediately offered their support without questioning our version of events or trying to minimize the severity of her actions. The stark difference between how David's family handled the crisis and how some of my relatives had initially responded helped me understand that healthy families protect their members from manipulation rather than enabling it through misguided attempts at neutrality or peacekeeping. David's mother, Susan, became an unexpected source of wisdom during our recovery. She'd experienced her own family betrayal years earlier when her sister had spread lies about Susan's parenting to try to gain custody of their elderly mother's inheritance. Susan's insights about the long-term process of rebuilding trust and setting boundaries proved invaluable. Susan introduced us to a support network of people who had survived similar family betrayals. This community included individuals who had dealt with manipulative siblings, parents, children, and extended family members who had used lies and emotional manipulation to achieve various goals. Meeting other people who had faced comparable challenges helped normalize our experience and provided practical strategies for maintaining our emotional health while protecting ourselves from future manipulation. The support group became a regular part of our lives, offering both friendship and ongoing education about relationship dynamics. The legal consultation we pursued helped us understand our options for protecting ourselves if Brooklyn's behavior escalated or if her lies caused professional or financial damage. While we ultimately didn't need to take legal action, understanding our rights and protections gave us confidence and peace of mind. The attorney we consulted specialized in defamation and harassment cases involving family members. She explained that family manipulation cases were becoming more common as people became more aware of psychological abuse and more willing to seek legal protection from relatives who caused serious harm. This legal education proved valuable when friends and support group members faced similar situations that did require restraining orders, cease and desist letters, or other formal interventions. We were able to provide referrals and guidance based on our own research and consultation process. the financial impact of Brooklyn's lies extended beyond the immediate costs of investigation and legal consultation. Her campaign had affected my professional reputation in subtle ways that took months to identify and address. Some colleagues had become distant after Brooklyn contacted them with concerns about my stability and performance. Rebuilding my professional relationships required careful, honest conversations where I explained what had happened without appearing defensive or unstable. The process taught me valuable skills for managing my reputation and communicating professionally about personal challenges. The experience also motivated David and me to document our assets, achievements, and relationships more systematically. We realized that protecting ourselves from future manipulation required maintaining clear records and evidence that could counter false narratives if they emerged. We developed systems for backing up communications, documenting important events, and maintaining professional references who could verify our character and accomplishments. These practices felt somewhat paranoid initially but proved valuable for general life management beyond just protection from manipulation. The creative outlets that emerged from processing our experience became sources of healing and connection with others facing similar challenges. I began writing a blog about family dynamics and manipulation recovery that attracted readers from around the world who shared their own stories and insights. The blog evolved into a podcast where David and I interviewed experts in psychology, family therapy, and conflict resolution. These conversations deepened our understanding of manipulation tactics and recovery strategies while creating content that helped other people navigate their own relationship challenges. David discovered a talent for graphic design through creating visual resources for our advocacy work. His infographics about recognizing manipulation tactics and building healthy boundaries became widely shared on social media, reaching audiences we couldn't have accessed through writing alone. The speaking opportunities that grew from our advocacy work allowed us to share our story with diverse audiences including university students, corporate employees, therapeutic professionals, and community organizations. Each presentation taught us something new about how manipulation affects different populations and contexts. We developed specialized presentations for different audiences: college students learning to navigate adult relationships, newlyweds establishing boundaries with extended family, parents dealing with manipulative relatives who targeted their children, and professionals managing difficult workplace dynamics. The feedback from these presentations reinforced our understanding that manipulation and family betrayal were far more common than most people realized. Audience members frequently approached us afterward to share their own experiences and seek guidance for their specific situations. The mentoring relationships that developed from our speaking work became some of the most meaningful aspects of our post-Brooklyn advocacy. We began offering one-on-one guidance to people facing particularly complex or dangerous manipulation situations that required individualized strategies and support. These mentoring relationships taught us about the diverse ways manipulation manifests in different family structures, cultural contexts, and relationship dynamics. Each person's story added to our understanding of human psychology and effective intervention strategies. The research project we undertook to better understand family manipulation led us to collaborate with academic researchers studying psychological abuse, family systems dysfunction, and recovery processes. Contributing to formal research helped validate our experience while advancing understanding of these dynamics. Our participation in research studies provided access to cutting-edge information about manipulation tactics, trauma recovery, and relationship rebuilding that enhanced both our personal healing and our ability to help others facing similar challenges. The annual conference we eventually organized brings together survivors of family manipulation, therapeutic professionals, researchers, and advocates to share resources and strategies. The conference has become a significant event in the family therapy and abuse recovery communities. Planning and hosting the conference each year provides ongoing opportunities to connect with experts and survivors from around the world. These relationships have enriched our understanding of manipulation dynamics while creating a global network of people committed to addressing these issues. The scholarship program we expanded beyond Grandma Helen's initial fund now supports research into family manipulation, training for therapeutic professionals, and education for young people about healthy relationship dynamics. The program has funded dozens of students and projects that advance understanding and intervention in this field. The documentary film project that grew from our story is currently in production, combining our narrative with expert interviews and other survivor stories to create educational content for general audiences. The film will reach people who might not seek out written resources or attend presentations about these topics. Working with filmmakers to tell our story visually has been both challenging and healing, requiring us to revisit difficult memories, while also celebrating our growth and recovery. The process has deepened our appreciation for how far we've come since that rainy afternoon when I first saw Brooklyn with Ryan. Looking forward, our work continues to evolve as we learn more about manipulation dynamics and develop more effective strategies for prevention and intervention. The foundation we built through surviving Brooklyn's betrayal has become the basis for meaningful work that helps others while continuing to strengthen our own relationship and personal growth. The most important lesson from our entire journey is that authentic love and genuine care create relationships that become stronger when tested by truth and transparency. The people who truly support your well-being will stand with you when you expose manipulation and lies, while those who enabled or participated in deception will reveal themselves through their resistance to accountability and change. The unexpected connection we discovered with other survivors led to the formation of a national network focused on family manipulation awareness and recovery. This network operates through online forums, regional meetups, and annual gatherings that provide ongoing support for people at various stages of their healing journeys. The network has become self-sustaining, with experienced survivors mentoring newcomers and sharing resources that help people recognize manipulation earlier in the process. Many members have gone on to pursue careers in counseling, social work, or advocacy, using their personal experiences to help others in professional capacities. The children's program we developed teaches young people about healthy relationship boundaries and manipulation recognition through age-appropriate workshops and educational materials. These programs are now used in schools, youth organizations, and community centers across multiple states. Working with children and teenagers has been particularly rewarding because it allows us to provide tools for recognizing and resisting manipulation before patterns become established. Many young participants have shared stories about applying these skills in their own family situations or peer relationships. The workplace training curriculum we created addresses manipulation dynamics in professional environments, helping organizations identify and address toxic behavior patterns that damage team cohesion and productivity. These training programs have been implemented by corporations, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies. The business applications of our manipulation recognition skills have proven surprisingly valuable, as many workplace conflicts involve similar psychological tactics to those used in family manipulation. Understanding these dynamics helps organizations create healthier cultures and more effective leadership structures. The international expansion of our advocacy work began when survivors from other countries reached out through our online presence. We've now facilitated training sessions and support groups in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and several European countries where family manipulation is recognized as a significant social issue. Cultural differences in family dynamics and manipulation tactics have provided valuable insights into how these behaviors manifest across different societies. Some cultures have stronger traditions of family hierarchy that can enable manipulation, while others have community structures that provide more protection against individual predators. The research partnership we established with a major university has produced several published studies on family manipulation patterns, victim recovery processes, and effective intervention strategies. This academic validation has helped legitimize the issue and secure funding for expanded research and programming. Our contribution to the academic literature has opened doors for speaking at professional conferences, consulting with therapeutic organizations, and influencing policy discussions about family abuse and manipulation. The combination of lived experience and research-based knowledge has made our perspectives particularly valuable to professionals working in this field. The crisis intervention hotline we helped establish provides immediate support for people discovering family manipulation or facing confrontations with manipulative relatives. The hotline operates 24/7 and has handled thousands of calls from people seeking guidance during acute crisis situations. Training hotline volunteers has deepened our understanding of the diverse ways manipulation manifests and the various resources people need during different phases of recognition and recovery. Each call teaches us something new about effective intervention strategies and support approaches. The Safe House network we developed provides temporary housing for people who need to leave manipulative family situations but lack financial resources or alternative support systems. These facilities have helped dozens of individuals extract themselves from harmful environments and begin independent lives. Operating safe houses has required learning about trauma-informed care, security protocols, and community resource coordination. The complexity of these operations has expanded our skills and deepened our appreciation for the comprehensive support needed by manipulation survivors. The legal advocacy program we established helps survivors understand their rights and access appropriate legal protections when family manipulation escalates to harassment, stalking, or financial abuse. Many people don't realize they have legal options for protecting themselves from manipulative relatives. Working with attorneys specializing in family law, restraining orders, and defamation has educated us about the legal frameworks available for addressing manipulation and abuse. This knowledge has proven invaluable for helping survivors navigate complex legal situations and protect their interests. The technological tools we developed include smartphone apps that help people document manipulation incidents, secure communication platforms for survivors, and online assessment tools that help individuals recognize manipulation patterns in their own relationships. The app development process taught us about user interface design, data security, and the specific technological needs of people dealing with manipulation and abuse. These tools have been downloaded by users in dozens of countries and have received positive feedback from both survivors and therapeutic professionals. The corporate consulting practice that emerged from our advocacy work helps businesses identify and address manipulation dynamics that can destroy team effectiveness and organizational culture. Many companies struggle with employees who use psychological manipulation to advance their careers or avoid accountability. Our corporate training programs teach managers to recognize manipulation tactics, document concerning behaviors, and implement policies that protect honest employees while addressing manipulative individuals. This work has been particularly valuable in sales organizations, healthcare systems, and educational institutions where manipulation can have serious consequences. The media appearances we've made on television, radio, and podcast programs have reached millions of people with information about family manipulation and recovery resources. Each media opportunity allows us to share our story while educating audiences about these often hidden dynamics. Preparing for media appearances has improved our communication skills and helped us distill complex psychological concepts into accessible language that general audiences can understand and apply. These communication skills have enhanced all aspects of our advocacy and professional work. The book tour that accompanied the publication of our memoir took us to bookstores, libraries, and community centers across the country where we met readers who shared their own stories and sought guidance for their situations. These personal connections reinforced the widespread nature of family manipulation and the hunger for resources and support. The international translation of our book has allowed our story to reach audiences in multiple languages and cultural contexts. Readers from diverse backgrounds have shared how our experience resonates with their own family dynamics. Despite significant cultural differences, the therapeutic training program we developed trains counselors, social workers, and other mental health professionals to recognize and address family manipulation in their practice. Many therapeutic professionals lack specific training in these dynamics and struggle to help clients who are dealing with manipulative family members. The training curriculum combines psychological theory with practical intervention strategies and real-world case studies drawn from our advocacy work. Participants learn to identify manipulation patterns, support survivors effectively, and avoid common mistakes that can inadvertently enable manipulative behavior. The policy advocacy work we've undertaken focuses on improving legal protections for family manipulation survivors and increasing awareness among law enforcement, judicial personnel, and social service providers. Many existing laws and policies don't adequately address psychological manipulation that doesn't involve physical violence. Our policy recommendations have been incorporated into legislation in several states that strengthens protections against family harassment and manipulation. This work requires ongoing engagement with lawmakers, law enforcement agencies, and judicial systems to educate them about these dynamics. The prevention programs we've developed for high schools and colleges teach young adults about healthy relationship dynamics and manipulation recognition before they establish long-term romantic partnerships or independent family relationships. Early education can prevent many manipulation situations from developing or escalating. These prevention programs have been particularly effective with college students who are beginning to establish independence from their families of origin and making decisions about future relationships. Many participants have reported using the skills to recognize and address manipulation in dating relationships, friendships, and family interactions. The reunion gatherings we organize annually for our support network community have become celebrations of healing, growth, and authentic connection. These events remind us of how far we've all come and reinforce our commitment to helping others navigate similar challenges. Each reunion features workshops, presentations by experts, and opportunities for community members to share their stories and insights. The energy and resilience of our community continues to inspire us and validates the importance of the work we're doing together. The legacy we're building through all of these initiatives extends far beyond our personal recovery. From Brooklyn's Betrayal, we've created resources, networks, and knowledge that will continue helping people long after our own direct involvement ends. The ripple effects of choosing truth over comfort, authenticity over convenience, and genuine love over performed loyalty continue expanding through every person we've helped, every professional we've trained, and every policy we've influenced. Brooklyn's attempt to destroy my marriage for her own selfish purposes ultimately became the catalyst for meaningful work that serves thousands of people facing similar challenges. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.